Whatever glimpse of hope that is left of an NCAA tournament bid for the Kansas State Wildcats starts and ends in Orlando.
You are Locked On Kansas State, your daily podcast on the Kansas State Wildcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome on into Locked On Kansas State, your daily Kansas State Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Keyshawn Hall, and thank you so much for making Locked On Kansas State your first listen every single day. Welcome back to my everydayers. We have a special crossover episode edition for you today, where myself and Mike Giddens of Locked On UCF break down the game coming up tonight between the Wildcats and the Knights. It should be a good one. I hope you enjoy. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet hits. Be sure to check that out at FanDuel.com. All right, let's get you on over to the Locked On crossover.
You are Locked On College Crossover, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into a special crossover edition of Locked On Podcast, Locked On Kansas State, Locked On UCF. I'm Keyshawn Hall. You can find the show at Locked On K-State, here with Mike Giddens of Locked On UCF. Mike Giddens, you can find him on Twitter at Mike Giddens. Hey, Mike, this is going to be a really interesting game going into Wednesday night. Kansas State traveling to UCF, taking on the Knights. And to me, you know, when you look at the standings, it might not be an exciting game, but this one does have a little bit of the last seconds, like the last will for each team. And you look at the bracketology, when you see the bubble watch, if you will, at one moment in time, Kansas State was there. UCF was finding their way to get there. Now we're seeing just a small amount of percentage for each team to possibly make it as an at-large bid. I think UCF actually has a better advantage right now. I think I saw the bubble watch showing 3%, a whole whopping 3% for UCF to make the tournament. Kansas State at 2% after their 3-game losing streak, one that just happened in the West Coast with Utah and BYU. And then, of course, the one that happened against Arizona State just the other day. UCF, though, got a win in their last matchup. Take me through them real quick as we can start going on and get closer to this game and previewing this one. Take me through the UCF Knights. What's going on with their season this year? Because as someone looking from the outside in and maybe not seeing a lot of UCF basketball this year, I see just a 14-13 team, a 5-11 conference win. Like, that's just the things from the outside. But what is this team missing for them not to be a top Big 12 contender?
You know, I talk about this all the time with my friend Andrew Glucko from The Last Word on Sports. It's depth. Right at the one deep, UCF is extremely talented. Keyshawn Hall is one of the best scorers in the conference. But beyond that, they get nothing from their bench night in and night out, Christian. So Johnny Dawkins is in a precarious situation here at the end of the season where he's got to build some sort of momentum. And in my mind, UCF's not really playing for the NCAA tournament right now. You've got the NIT sitting out there, and you've got this kind of like secondary tournament thing that Fox is doing that's going to provide more postseason opportunities for some basketball teams. But if you're UCF right now, your goal is get some positive momentum headed into this offseason, do some work in the portal, and return as many players as you can. So they've had tough battles so far this year. A 4-point loss to Kansas, a 1-point loss to Houston, games that they could have gotten. And when you talk about those net standings, UCF and Kansas State not too far off each other in the net right now. UCF at 78, Kansas State at 81. 3-9 right now in quad one games. That easily could have been 5-7 in quad one games, whereas Kansas State like 4-8 in quad ones. So some impressive wins there for both teams, but I don't see that signature win there for UCF. So when you go up against Kansas, when you go up against Houston, what you're seeing is they're battling them down to the wire, and then they run out of gas because they're dog dead tired, and everybody's played like 36 minutes, and the bench is giving you nothing.
Yeah, I could see this one being a track meet for sure. I've seen that a couple times with Kansas State this past season, watching them play certain types of basketball and them having to go, multiple minutes, as you mentioned, and running out of just actual gas. And yeah, Kansas State found themselves lucky on a couple of those quad one wins, if you will. They did have a really great game against Iowa State in Iowa. They played well against Kansas the second time around in Manhattan, but they didn't play well against Houston. Something that you did with UCF. I mean, if you go back to that game, UCF only lost to Houston, and as you mentioned, 69-68. Not many people even put 68 points on Houston this year. That is a huge win alone. And if you can find a way to get momentum from that, now obviously that happened about over a month ago now, but if you can find a way to get little victories from that, I think that's a good win for UCF moving forward. The two things that come to my mind as of recent, Mike, and I'm sure this is probably something you've talked about over on your show, is obviously you guys gave the first win to the Big 12 to Colorado just a few weeks ago. Yeah, that was obviously not a great feeling, but that happened. But then you turn around and get a win against Utah, and it's the final game for Utah for Craig Smith before they let him go. So you got at least that little notch on your belt as well. Now you go and take on Kansas State. You host them, a team that has had ups and downs. We were talking before the show, and what I think about Kansas State this year is they have played to be some of the worst basketball I think I've ever seen Kansas State play this season. Then for about a 6-game stretch, and I think many can agree with me, they were the best team in the country. I mean, we saw other media outlets talk about how great this team was. We saw national media talking about how Kansas State could not only be a bubble team, but find themselves in the tournament after beating teams like Iowa State, like Kansas, like West Virginia, some ranked teams in that 6-game stretch. Then the West Coast came along. BYU turned into that team, which obviously I think BYU is going to be a really fun team. We're going to have to talk about the conference here in a minute. And Utah, we couldn't take care of Utah last week. Arizona State came down, and now you find this team back down into the bottom of the Big 12 standings. This game on Wednesday night, I think, has a small opportunity to, one, it's going to probably help with some seeding in the Big 12 tournament. But I think you and I both can agree that when it's all said and done here, between both these teams, this win's not going to change much for their resume for an at-large bid. And it's probably when it's probably meaning that both these teams have to win it all in Kansas City.
Yeah, look, you are what your regular season says you are in terms of how the committee views tournament seeding. So you're absolutely right. The only thing that changes the math for either team is winning the Big 12 tournament and getting that auto qualifier bid. That's going to be a tall task. Now, is it impossible? No. We've seen teams go on runs through conference tournaments from the bottom where, those teams getting the bye there are maybe a little bit cold. And if you're on a heater coming into the quarterfinals, maybe you have a chance to make some noise. Now, here's where I think UCF can actually do it. We've seen them go toe-to-toe with Houston. We've seen them go toe-to-toe with Kansas. Those teams aren't infallible, and they can be beat. But you've got to be able to hold on for dear life at the end and, possibly play the basketball of your life if you're going to do this. And UCF has a chance to do that. So this game between K-State and UCF is about building momentum headed into that tournament so that there is at least a belief by your players that they can go out there and they can shock the world in the Big 12 tournament. But if you're going to go in on a losing streak, because prior to being in Utah and UCF somehow handing Craig Smith his walking papers, they were on a 7-game losing streak. That hasn't happened in Orlando since the 15-16 season. And matter of fact, it's the first 7-game losing streak under current head coach Johnny Dawkins' tenure. So it was important to get off that slide. They did that. Now you have to create a mini streak going. Again, it's not going to change your tournament math, but it may be able to provide your players, your team, some belief that headed into the Big 12 tournament, we can shock the world night after night and maybe make it to that Big 12 final game. And who knows what happens.
Speaking of streaks, Kansas State is not good on the road this year. They only have 2 road wins. They had a 15-game losing streak before they broke that streak in Iowa State, by the way. They did it in Ames, which was super surprising. But since then, they had a terrible time on the road against BYU, against Utah, and now they have another chance to take care of, maybe see if they can figure it out once again. Jerome Tang, can he do it on the road against UCF? It's hard for me to have a lot of optimism of this team after what I've seen them the last 3 games. Oh, and by the way, there's also a very strong chance that their best player, Coleman Hawkins, won't be playing for the second game in a row with a knee bruise. So we'll see more about that heading into Wednesday's game. This is going to be an interesting one. I'm looking forward to it, Mike. It should be a blast. Before we get into the predictions and maybe a little bit more talk on this game, we probably should just talk about the Big 12 conference as a whole, because this conference is going to have plenty of teams in the tournament, whether it's UCF or Kansas State or not, but there's going to be plenty. I think we should have a talk about that right here. So on the special crossover edition of Locked On Kansas State and Locked On UCF. This episode is sponsored by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place than to get it on than with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip or want to be on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. If you're looking for a bigger payout, or if you even combine some live bets, or check out their same game parlays. I love using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps me in the moment of the games that are just so exciting, whether I'm backing my team for a late game rally or picking up a hit for a clutch 3. I never feel like I miss a single chance. Plus, the app is one of the best apps in all of the industry. I love the interface. So check that out when you can. And you get paid instantly when you win. How can you not enjoy that type of feature? Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet hits. So just visit FanDuel.com to get started and join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment count with FanDuel, the official partner of the NBA. Welcome back to this very special Locked On crossover edition, Locked On Kansas State, Locked On UCF. For your second listen of the day, check out Locked On Big 12. Of course, we're going to tell you that. Check out the squad show on Thursday. They got plenty going on over there. Drake Toll has you covered about everything in the Big 12 conference. You can check that out for your second listen of the day. We're rocking this conversation right now as we get closer to this game tonight between UCF and Kansas State. But first, let's take a step back, Mike, and kind of look at a bigger picture of the Big 12 conference here, because unfortunately, both our teams right now are not sitting in the driver's seat. There's no doubt about that. As we mentioned with the bubble watch, we're at a 2% and 3% chance of making an at-large bid. We both know that if they want to make a March Madness tournament, they're probably going to have to win it all and make a huge run in Kansas City in the Big 12 tournament championship. But with that being said, there are plenty of really good squads this year in the Big 12. You talk about Houston already, a team that UCF only lost by 1. Kansas State didn't have a single chance in that one. I thought Houston outmatched them in every single facet of the game when they played. You have Iowa State, who's a really good team this year, Texas Tech. There's a lot of really good teams, and I'm pretty sure that we saw multiple of them. I think we saw 3 or 4 of them in the top 10 in the net rankings in the last rankings that just came out. What's your overall take of this conference right now as we're getting closer to March and getting into the greatest month of college basketball?
Looking at that top 10 of the net rankings, like you said, Houston sitting at number 3 currently, Texas Tech at 7, Iowa State at 8, Arizona at 9. So like you said, the Big 12 has got some marquee programs here. But in terms of the current bracketology, Houston just outside the 1 seed in that 2 seed. I think they end up being a 1 seed when it's all said and done, Christian, because there are 3 SEC teams in the 1 seed slots right now. As we're recording this, Florida just fell to Georgia. And Alabama is in that 1 seed slot as well, too. And those teams have to play each other. So I think by process of elimination, the SEC is going to eliminate one of those teams. The other team is Auburn. I think they're the number 1 overall seed in the tournament at this point. Nothing changes there. But Houston rises to a 1 seed in my book. In the 3 seed category, you've got Iowa State sitting there. And then in 4 seed territory, there's Arizona and there's Kansas and there's Texas Tech. So plenty of marquee opportunities for the Big 12, I think, here in the tournament. And look, maybe even a little underrated as a conference coming into this one. There's a lot of focus on the SEC right now, possibly putting 10 to 12, maybe even 13 teams into the NCAA tournament. But the Big 12 consistently makes noise going deep into the tournament. And I think this is why they're one of the best basketball tournaments in the country.
Yeah, that phone call right there was Brett Yormark calling you and saying, hey, stop talking about the SEC. He was probably saying ESPN already does that enough. Don't do that on this show, please. No, I'm with you, though. I think that it's going to come down to being the Big 12 and the SEC when it's all said and done. I would not be shocked if 3 of the 4 teams of the Final 4 are Big 12 and SEC teams. Like I'm not afraid to make that assumption right now, and that would probably be good odds if you had to play that game. But I am with you. I think the Big 12 conference is very underrated at the moment. You look at the fact that they have 5 top 25 ranked teams right now. I think BYU finally got in there, and I think it was much deserved. And although Kansas steps out for the first time since 2021, which makes me happy, by the way, but the fact that Kansas was stepped out of the top 25 for the first time in just 4 years, they're going to find a way to bounce back. And I wouldn't be shocked if it was in Kansas City during that Big 12 tournament. So I think there's a definite chance of seeing 7, 8, and there could be a small chance of getting 9 Big 12 teams in this tournament. It'd be nice if it was a Kansas State or a UCF being a big dealer towards the end of the season, though. What do you think about that?
Look, if somebody always rises and knocks off somebody who probably was more deserving. I think that people need to understand that runs in conference tournaments do not improve your chances of making the NCAA tournament unless you win the whole damn thing, Christian. You got to go all the way. The committee, we've got years of precedent at this point with the committee showing us they don't care. They don't care. Now, the Big 12 was smart enough to move their championship game from Sunday to Saturday because they're still making the decisions early Saturday morning. And if you have a team that made a run to the Big 12 title game, then there's some chance they might factor the results into their decision. I read an article recently talking about how they create 10 to 15 contingencies based on who could make a run to say, even though we don't know the results of these tournaments, we're going to put this team in, or we feel like this team is more deserving. So you've just got to take that out of the equation, and that's what Kansas State and UCF didn't do, right? You've left your tournament fate in the subjective hands of the committee. So the only way to take it out is to win that Big 12 tournament, but you need more than just a good run, to win it. Obviously, if you're in one of those last seeds going in, you've got to win like 4 or 5 games straight and then head into the tournament on a heater, and that's just not realistic, I think, especially because if you're one of those teams, you probably don't have the firepower and you're going to run out of gas. I saw Texas A&M make one of the most epic runs a couple of years ago through the SEC tournament. Everybody said, you got to put these guys in, and they left them out completely, and everyone lost their minds.
I remember that.
So, it's just one of those things where if you want the tournament to matter, you already got to be in, or you got to win it all. So, look, these two teams have work to do. Kansas State is in better position, I think, than UCF, obviously at 7-9 in conference. But if you win your last 4 and you can get above 500, because your last game is against Iowa State, so you have a chance to make a real splash at the end. You could end it with a marquee quad 1 win. That's the opportunity that UCF had but squandered and is no longer on their schedule.
Yeah, that's a tough one for me because I felt really good about the opportunities that they had in front of them before that Arizona State game, but they just laid an egg. And obviously it had to do with Coleman Hawkins not being in the game, and he obviously drives the bus for this team. And there's just a lot of things that just didn't go right with the fact that he sat. There was rebounding was the only thing that went right, and they've struggled with rebounding all year, but for some reason they found a way to out rebound Arizona State. But they struggled with assists, they struggled with shot selection. They just looked lost out there. So if they're missing Coleman Hawkins again in Orlando on Wednesday night, I would be really interested to see what Jerome Tang has in store for him. Going back to that Big 12 talk real quick about the tournament, though, because I'm with you. I do think that the only chance is a team like UCF's or Kansas State to find a way in the tournament is winning it all. If you go back to last year, which for the record, it's going to be a different kind of tournament. There was only 14 teams last year. You don't have Arizona State, Arizona, the Big 12 teams that came in this season. No team, with the exception of Kansas State, who won 1 game they were the 10 seed. They beat 7 seed Texas, and 11 seed Cincinnati beat 6 seed Kansas Jayhawks, but no other team had upsets in the tourney. The Final 4 in the Big 12 tournament were seeds 1 through 4. The final game was Houston versus Iowa State, seed 1 versus seed 2. Iowa State, who was the second seed, wound up winning the Big 12 conference, but that's not really an upset when you're 1 versus 2 in the championship game. So the odds are not in their favor if you want to make a run in this tournament. And I think that it's just as well, if you look at it, what we're seeing again this year, it is another top-heavy part of this conference with the top 4 and just adding in Arizona to the mix. You didn't have that last year. If teams like BYU maybe can make a run for it, but I think it's really tough if a team like Kansas State or UCF is going to make it. What I'm just trying to say here is if you're going to put a bet in with our friends over at FanDuel or something like that, or plan on putting a Big 12 tournament tattoo on right now, I might not want to do that. Maybe use erasable ink, Mike, in this case.
Look, love the plug for our partner FanDuel there. That's great. Look, lots of great opportunities. The tournament is about upsets. It's, I think that's what makes the college basketball postseason one of the greatest postseasons in all of sports, is that truly the amount of teams that they give a shot to be their best selves game after game and try to make a run. Every year we see a Cinderella make a deep run into the tournament. It's fantastic to watch, and it's great TV. It's the best TV that you'll watch anywhere. At the end of the day, if you're a fan of UCF or K-State, you just hope that your team is part of the conversation when it comes to it at the end of the season. So I personally am looking forward to this tournament. I think this has a chance to be one of the most exciting NCAA tournaments we've seen in quite some time.
I'm with you. I do think it's going to be one of the most exciting ones for sure. And hopefully both our teams find a way to make it. But if not, it's still going to be super exciting. All right, let's tie it all together. Let's get our predictions and thoughts on this game as we wrap up this special Locked On crossover edition here on Locked On Kansas State and Locked On UCF. And welcome back. Let's get your predictions right now. We didn't talk about it, but they played last year, of course, because it was the first time UCF was in the Big 12. Kansas State won the game 77-52. Now, obviously, a lot of things have changed between both of those teams. A lot of transfers left for Kansas State. So I don't even know if you can really take any of that in consideration this year because Kansas State is a completely different basketball team. I'm not sure if that's the same for UCF, but it definitely certainly feels that way. I'm also with you by the fact and I agree with you how you said at the beginning of this show that you think that they need momentum. UCF needs momentum to bring back as many players as they possibly can to reload and get ready to go for next season. That's the same boat that I feel that I'm in right now for Kansas State. There are multiple players with the exception of maybe a Coleman, Hawkins, David Gasson, who are going to be moving on. There are plenty of players that can return back for Kansas State in 2020. 5 to 6, however you want to call that, with Dug McDaniel, with Brennan Hawson. And there's just a lot of exciting players that I would like to see stick around with this squad. The transfer portal became one of those things where it was a hit and miss kind of situation for Kansas State this year because they finally spent a lot of money, Mike, bringing in guys like Coleman, Hawkins. And a lot of people thought this team was going to make a deep run into the tournament, and it obviously did not pan out that way. Does UCF, do you feel like that's the same boat they're in, or do you feel like they're maybe one step farther behind or forward? How do you feel like that before I get your predictions for today's show?
Oh, well, Johnny Dawkins is coaching for his job. So let's start there. He's got to have something positive for him headed into this offseason. Current AD, Terry Mohajir, he didn't hire him. He didn't hire this guy, but, he stuck with him so far. Fan sentiment is starting to turn on him, and he's got to find a way to bolster this roster. Now, you talked about the portal. Well, not only has the portal changed college basketball, but NIL has also changed college basketball. And we're seeing big changes come to NIL here in a couple months with schools potentially taking over the NIL process directly, collectives either dissolving and going away or being absorbed into the university financial structure. And you're going to have to spend money to compete. Lots of great questions about, or do we institute salary caps and how do we even it out across the playing field? Does this make the current NCAA obsolete? Do you even need them as a governing body for college sports if, this has become mini pros? What is the best structure? So, looking at it, UCF is in a position where there's talent in Orlando. Christian, there's talent there. these guys have battled it out with the best of them. Darius Johnson, you've got the young guy, Mikey Williams, who they've been trying to bring along so far this year. Neves Machowski, Keyshawn Hall is one of the best scorers in the entire conference. And right now, you would know by record, but UCF is the 5th best scoring team in the Big 12 right now at 78.9 points per game. Arizona is the best at 81.6. They're only they're less than 3 points better than UCF. So it really has been about depth. They haven't not been able to close out games. They're close to something special, I think. And if you can, one thing we don't talk about enough is that not only is recruiting in the portal important, but you have to re-recruit your roster at the end of every year too, because people are trying to poach your players. They're trying to entice, somebody's going to come after and say, Keyshawn Hall's wasting his talent at UCF. And now you can transfer as many times as you want without penalty. You've got to sell to him, you know what? Your talent is not wasted here. Believe in the vision that we have for UCF basketball and continue to carry the UCF Knights flag into next season. It's a really, really difficult job for coaches. So I think that's what encompasses UCF's position right now. Is there's a ton of work to do on Dawkins is going to be fighting battles on 3 or 4 different fronts this offseason. And it starts with winning games down the stretch and maybe making some sort of run in the Big 12 tournament that does not get you into the tournament, but is a sign to your fan base, your alumni base, your donor base, the people who are going to be giving those NIL dollars, that you have this program headed the right direction. And this year was an aberration and an anomaly.
Yeah, and you can make statement wins, to be completely honest, with the rest of your schedule before the Big 12 tournament play. This Kansas State game, obviously, although they're on a down year, they have quad 1 wins, so you can take that to the bank and say they have been a good team in the past. Winning against a coach like Jerome Tang, that's a win. TCU hasn't been a slouch this year. Oklahoma State's had their ups and downs, and West Virginia was ranked at one point. So there's an opportunity, if you can find a way to gain some momentum and build off that Utah win. Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of things to be happy about heading into Kansas City for the Big 12 tournament, whether that means a March Madness bid or not. Who's the one player that you are looking at right now, knowing that Kansas State right now could be maybe out? Coleman Hawkins probably not going to play on Wednesday. I'm doubting it. I haven't heard otherwise, but I'm doubting it just based on the way that Coach Tang talked about him in the press conference after the Arizona State game. He talked about how he's planning on, going day by day without him. So with that being said, you have a game plan that we don't know what's going to work with Kansas State. It obviously didn't work against Arizona State. If you're UCF right now, who is the X factor that can take them to win this basketball game on Wednesday night?
I'm always stuck between Keyshawn Hall and Darius Johnson. But at the end of the day, it's Keyshawn Hall. It's Keyshawn Hall, and it's Keyshawn Hall again. He is the conference's leading scorer right now. This is why I'm telling you, again, there's talent there. Darius Johnson is the 11th best scorer. So you have, and there's some ties there. So, I'm going to shove Darius into the top 10. We'll just say he's a top 10 scorer.
Go for it.
Right. You've got 2 top 10 scorers on your team, and your squad is where you're at. So you've got talent. You just don't have depth. There's nobody behind them right now that can, hold the game down and spell those guys. Keyshawn Hall's averaging almost 33 minutes per game. He's exhausted at the end of games, and just under 19 points per game. It's Keyshawn Hall. You go as he goes. If he can't score, you're going to be in trouble. And I think that's what it boils down to. You're at your best when the conference's best scorer is doing what the conference's best scorer does. So that's why I see that.
I'm so excited to see the all Big Ten squad when it's all said and done, who gets first team, second team, because I think there's going to be some surprises on there, but I think they're going to be well worthwhile. A guy like Hall, I think David Gasson deserves to be on there as well. I'm really excited to see that when that is announced. I'm going with Dug McDaniel, because Dug McDaniel, if there's no Coleman Hawkins, he has to lead the charge. He has to be a better shooter. He's got to be a better facilitator. He's got to be the guy that leads this Kansas State offense to actually show a pulse, to actually show some sort of rhythm. Brennan Hawson, if he can shoot, great 3-4 3-pointers and get them going on the 3-point line and not shoot 18% from 3 points like they did in the last game. That obviously helps, but Dug McDaniel has to be that guy to step forward for Kansas State. With that being said, Kansas State has 4 games left this season. As much as it kills me to say that, me trying to be optimistic in this one, and as much as I haven't felt great about the last 3 games, I'm going to lean Kansas State here and think they take this win from you, Mike, because I think they have a small chance of still getting to the tournament if they can win out. Obviously, that Iowa State game means so much, but it starts with game 1, and it starts in Orlando.
Look, I'm inclined to agree with you, but I'm not. The UCF Knights, he just took down the Utah Utes, and I just told you Keyshawn Hall is going to do what Keyshawn Hall does. I think that UCF is the more desperate team coming into this matchup. I think they show that in this one. Again, if they hit their averages, if both teams hit their averages, then Kansas State's going to have a hard time in this one, I think, personally. So I'm going with the Knights here. I know that's the homer pick, but I believe the stats are on my side. The stat gods are on my side, Christian.
It's hard to disagree with you there. Mike Giddens, Locked On UCF. That's where you can find him. All the great stuff from the UCF Knights. Make sure you subscribe for them if you're listening to the Kansas State squad, Kansas State side. And hey, Knights fans, if you want some Kansas State stuff coming in for college football season as well, you can check out Locked On Kansas State. Thanks, Mike. This was a good time.
Thanks for having me.
Please like the video. Please subscribe. This has been a Locked On crossover.